A shalom, shalom, shalom lakam, which is peace unto you all. Ha'ay rab tawab la adam. Za achikam yawam an chakadal Charlotte, which is good evening. This is your brother Yawam from the GMS camp in Charlotte. Nachamatam kaya malakatha shemayim kwa repent ye for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Call layim la abanawa Yahweh. Bahasham Yahweh Shai, Bahasham Racha HaKodash. Wamashan Allah Zakim Nawa, Wamala Akim Shara Chagadal, which is all praises to our Father Yahweh, which means he exists. Bahasham, in the name Yahweh Shai, he delivers in double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. This is Isaiah chapter 63, and we'll get verse 1. And it says, Who is this that cometh from Edom with dyed garments from Basra? This that is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength. I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save. All right, in which the Lord Yahweh Shai, when he returns, he's going to come back and destroy essentially the hegemonies and power structures of Esau, Edom, the so-called white man. All right, in which is going to be various different places across the planet. All right, but one of those chief places is America, Babylon, the Great. All right, so it says with dyed garments from Basra. All right, which Basra goes into a chief city, a capital city in Edom. It says this that is glorious in his apparel. All right, because previously when the Lord, was walking the earth, when he came in the flesh, he came in the flesh, in manly flesh. All right. But when he returns, all right, ultimately he's going to come back in his majestic form. All right. This is Isaiah chapter 47 and verse 3. And it says, Thy nakedness shall be uncovered, yet thy shame shall be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will not meet thee as a man. All right. It says, as for our Redeemer, the Lord of hosts is his name, the Holy One of Yasharallah, in which the Lord Yahweh is dispatching his son Yahweh Shai to ultimately, take vengeance. All right, going into verse 3, it says, thy nakedness shall be uncovered, yet thy shame shall be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will not meet thee as a man. All right, because when the Lord Yahweh Shai returns, ultimately, he's going to come back in his angelic form. All right, and that's ultimately how the vengeance is going to be taken. All right, so going back to Isaiah 63 and verse 1, it says, this that is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength. All right, because how the Lord ultimately traverses, all right, is via the chariots. All right, let's get this. This is Psalms chapter 68 and verse 17, and it says, the chariots of the Most High are 20,000, even thousands of angels. The Lord is among them, as in Sinai, in the holy place. All right, in which in the ancient world, the Lord Yahweh Shai, that's what this is referring to. All right, which is multiple scriptures which we don't have to get, but essentially the Lord Yahweh Shai, he was in Sinai, in the chariot. All right, so let's also get this. This is Jude chapter 1, and we'll get verse 14. And it says, and Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints, to execute judgment upon all, and to convince all that are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, which they have ungodly committed, and of all their hard speeches, which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. These are murmurers, complainers, walking after their own lusts, and their mouth speaketh great swelling words, are the blasphemies, having men's persons in admiration because of advantage. All right, but it says right here in the latter of Jude 1 and 14, it says, well, I started from the top. It says, and Enoch also the seventh from Adam prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment upon all. All right, and then it reads down, you see, but the Lord is coming back, for vengeance, you see, because reading this down right here, all right, it says to execute judgment upon all, and to convince all that are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, which they have ungodly committed. All right, so for all of the blasphemies, for all of the wickedness, hey, that's what the vengeance is being taken for. All right, back to Isaiah 47 and verse 3. All right, and we'll get this word for vengeance. And it says naquam, and it says vengeance. It says avenged, revenge. All right. It says vengeance and revenge. It says the desire of vengeance. All right. So reading down from verse 1, all right, it says lament for Babylon. You see, because one thing, the subtitle in the blue letter, but because one thing that ultimately, one reason, or which is multiple, all right, it's a lot, even ones we don't know about, but one thing, scriptures say that, the prey departeth not, so Esau, Edom, essentially, he's, in charge of America, Babylon the Great, all right, and he has the children of Yasha'Allah in servitude. All right, so that's one thing that, that's part of that vengeance, or that's part of that vengeance that's being taken. All right. And also how he essentially how Esau Edom is running society, so the Lord is not pleased with the rulership. All right, so reading this back, Isaiah 63 and verse 1, it says, who is this that cometh from Edom with dyed garments from Basra? This that is glorious in his apparel. All right, the Lord is coming very majestically. All right, we got Isaiah 47 and 3. It says, traveling in the greatness of his strength. All right, the Lord is going to be traversing in the chariot. All right, with the angels. Let's get this too. This is Second Esdras chapter 13, and we'll get verse 3. And it says, verse 1, it says, and it came to pass after 7 days I dreamed a dream by night, and lo, there arose a wind from the sea, that it moved all the waves thereof. And I beheld, and lo, that man waxed strong with the thousands of heaven. And it keeps reiterating it. The thousands of heaven. Second Esdras, the 13th chapter, Jude 1 and 14, Psalm 68 and verse 17. All right, Deuteronomy, the 33rd chapter. All right, it says, and I beheld, and lo, that man waxed strong with the thousands of heaven. And when he turned his countenance to look, all things trembled that were seen under him. And whensoever the voice went out of his mouth, all they burned that heard his voice, like as the earth faileth when it faileth the fire. And after this I beheld, and lo, there was gathered together a multitude of men out of number from the four winds of heaven to subdue the man that came out of the sea. But I beheld, and lo, he graved himself a great mountain and flew up upon it. But I would have seen the region or place whereout the hill was graven, and I could not. All right, so that great mountain is talking about the father ship. All right, because that's ultimately how the Lord Yahweh Shai is going to be traversing and traveling. All right, that's why I said Isaiah 63, traveling in the greatness of his strength. All right, because it says greatness. All right, when we get this word for greatness, it says Rob. It says greatness. Let me see. It goes into abundance, because of the thousands of it says excellent, excellency. All right, which it goes into both, the abundance, because of the thousands of heaven. All right, it says huge. All right, goes into huge, Second Ezra 13th chapter. All right, and then also the excellency, you see, because when in comparison to what is on the planet Earth, Esau has, he has the Space Force, the Air Force, the Army, and so on and so forth, and they have the different aerial vehicles. All right, stealth bombers, C-130, so on and so forth. But they have nothing in comparison as to, what the Lord is coming with. All right. So in talking about, anything, all right, nothing that, our carnal eyes have seen amounts to, the creation and ultimately the power of the Lord. You see, that's why it says traveling in the greatness of his strength. You see, because the Lord Yahweh Shai is going to be traveling in the father ship. All right. So it says traveling in the greatness of his strength. All right. It says I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save. All right. In which again, the Lord Yahweh Shai is coming to destroy the hegemonies of Esau Edom. All right. And this also shows who's going to be in power. All right, during this time, all right, it would have to be Esau, even the so-called white man. Let's get this real fast, because this is a future prophecy. All right, Isaiah 63. All right, this shows that, which I'm gonna get this real fast. This is Second Ezra chapter 6 and verse 9. It says, "For Esau is the end of the world, and Jacob is the beginning of it that followeth." So we got the end time prophecies. So we understand. Esau Edom. He fits the blueprint. He fits the mold of who would, for one, all right, scripturally, all right, Esau, all right, again, it's talking about Esau. All right. But to see spiritually who is talking about. All right. And these times, because when we look at how Esau ultimately has constructed the different so-called races, all right, they are in terms what we understand today. All right, but when you line it up, how the scriptures say, measure thou the time diligently, or excuse me, and part of measuring the times diligently, all right, is having a biblical worldview in which we ultimately get that through the Spirit. So we understand that Esau Edom is the so-called white man, all right, and we understand that Isaiah 63 is a future prophecy, all right. So nevertheless, it says Second Ezra 6 and verse 9. It says I'll start at verse we'll start at verse 7. Second Ezra 6 and 7. It says, then answered I and said, which shall be the parting asunder of the times, or when shall be the end of the first and the beginning of it that followeth? And he answered unto me, from Abraham unto Isaac, when Jacob and Esau were born of him, Jacob's hand held first the heel of Esau, for Esau is the end of the world, and Jacob is the beginning of it that followeth. All right. And ultimately, Jake, the 12 tribes, we got next. All right. But essentially just going to the point that in the end times, Esau will be in rulership. So then the question would have to be, all right, well, who is Esau? All right. So we got all of the characteristics and stuff like that. So in the spirit, we can see that the so-called white man fits the traits of who biblically the Edomite would be. All right. So let's read this back and then that'll be it. But this is Isaiah 63 and verse 1. It says, who is this that cometh from Edom with thy garments from Basra? This that is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength. I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Because in these end times, all right, there's going to be the Lord deals in balance. All right, so it's going to be deliverance. All right, and it's going to be destruction. All right, so Esau, Edom being destroyed. All right, those is not ultimately destroyed. They're going to be rounded up for slavery. 2/3 going to be destroyed. They'll be born back in the kingdom. All right, but then that leaves deliverance. So who's being delivered? All right, who's being saved? All right, because the Lord deals with an elect. All right, so the elect ultimately is the ones that are going to be saved. So let's get this. This is Isaiah chapter 45, and we'll get verse 17. And it says, but Yashar Allah shall be saved in the Lord with an everlasting salvation. Ye shall not be ashamed nor confounded, world without end. In which the scriptures go into, they are not all of Israel, which are of Israel, because you have, those that are Israelites. All right, but then you have the Israel of the Most High, which will be the elect. All right, that's who's going to be delivered. All right, so let me see. Let's also get this. This is Isaiah chapter 13, and we'll get verse 15. And it says, everyone that is found shall be thrust through, and everyone that is joined unto them shall fall by the sword. Because, again, from Isaiah 63, the Lord is coming to destroy Esau, Edom's hegemony. All right, so those that don't want to repent, those that don't want to subscribe to the law, statutes, and commandments of the nation of Yahshua Allah, they'll be destroyed right along with Esau, Edom, and the heathen. All right, while, the scriptures say to arise ye and depart, for this is not your rest. Hey, well, those that put on as the elect ultimately are going to be the elect. All right, and they're going to be delivered. All right, that's why I said I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save. You see, because the Lord Yahweh Shai is coming to deliver his elect. All right, so just wanted to go into that. Adawan Tazaza Banayapa. Lord's will, that was a beautiful edification of the spirit. Adawan Tazah Atam Yashlai Latawab. Lord's will, you have a good night. Wa shalom lakam, which is peace to you all. Shalom, shalom.